Listen carefully. There are birth records in Virginia that were never meant to survive. Names written in ink that outlived fires, floods, and deliberate erasure. Children officially declared white. Heirs to land, money, and power. All sharing the same biological father, a man the law defined as property. This is not rumor. This is architecture. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. In the late 18th century, Virginia did not merely run on tobacco and blood. It ran on paperwork. Ledgers. Registries. Quiet agreements between men who understood that reality was not shaped by truth, but by what could be documented, sealed, and defended. What you are about to hear was hidden not because it was unbelievable, but because it was too revealing. It exposed a system so cold, so efficient, that morality itself became optional. Somewhere along the Rappahannock, a cluster of counties presented an anomaly that no official ever addressed publicly. Over the span of 2 decades, white planter families, many of them previously infertile, began producing children at statistically impossible rates. Healthy sons. Strong daughters. Inheritance lines suddenly secure. On paper, everything was legitimate. Married mothers. Respected husbands. Proper surnames. But beneath the surface, something moved with precision. The man at the center of it was never named in public discourse. In the records, he appears only as a number. No last name. No lineage. No voice. He was enslaved, yet curiously protected. Never sold. Never punished. Never worked to death in the fields like others of his condition. Instead, he was transferred quietly, temporarily from estate to estate. Always with permission. Always with documentation. Always returning to the same plantation when his work was done. This alone should disturb you. Slavery was not known for mercy. Exceptions were rare, and when they existed, they served a purpose. This man was not spared out of kindness. He was preserved because he was valuable in a way the law could not acknowledge. His body solved a problem that threatened the very identity of the ruling class, lineage. Understand this clearly. In colonial Virginia, a man without heirs was a man without a future. Land without sons fractured. Power dissipated. A name died. And in a society obsessed with legacy, infertility was a silent catastrophe. What emerged in response was not scandal, but strategy. The children multiplied. 7 families. Then more. Decades later, the count would reach a number so high it defied coincidence. And still, no charges were filed. No sermons preached. No trials convened. Because everyone who mattered understood the same forbidden truth, the system was working exactly as designed. This story is not about sex. It is about control. About how institutions bend reality to preserve themselves. And about a secret so dangerous that even acknowledging it threatens the myth of innocence America was built on. To understand how this could happen, you must first understand the machine it lived inside. Virginia's plantation society was not chaotic. It was engineered. Every law, every custom, every silence existed to protect one thing above all else: the uninterrupted transfer of power from one generation of white men to the next. Morality was flexible. Biology was inconvenient. Paperwork was sacred. The law declared that a child inherited status from the mother, not the father. That single legal principle created a loophole so vast it could swallow truth whole. If the mother was white and married, the child was white and legitimate, no questions asked, no blood tests imagined, no challenges permitted. Paternity was not a biological fact. It was a social agreement enforced by violence. This is where the system reveals its true genius. Everyone involved benefited, except the one man whose body made it possible. The husbands kept their names alive. The wives secured children and status. The county maintained stability. Even the church was spared the embarrassment of barren elites. And the enslaved man remained legally invisible, stripped of authorship over his own bloodline. You are taught to think of slavery as crude domination. Whips. Chains. Fields. But the most powerful form of control is not brutality. It is utility. This man was not beaten because he was too valuable. He was not freed because that would collapse the illusion. He existed in a narrow corridor between privilege and annihilation, guarded by men who would have killed him instantly if the secret ever escaped their control. The coordination required was extraordinary. Requests sent. Permissions granted. Timelines managed. Months calculated. Returns scheduled. This was not impulse. This was logistics. A reproductive supply chain operating under the cover of respectability. And notice something else. No one ever accused him publicly. Why? Because to accuse him would be to confess. The accusation would not land on the enslaved man, it would detonate inside the white households themselves. It would expose impotence, betrayal, racial anxiety, and legal hypocrisy all at once. Silence was safer. This is the first truth you must accept as a man seeking hidden knowledge: systems do not fear immorality. They fear exposure. As long as the secret served power, it was protected. And anyone who understood that learned to survive by saying nothing. This was not an affair. It was an institutional solution to a biological problem. And it sets the stage for something far darker than individual corruption. It reveals a society willing to rewrite reality itself to avoid confronting weakness. Once you see this, you begin to understand how empires endure. Not by being righteous but by being adaptable, ruthless, and very quiet. By the 1780s, the pattern was undeniable to anyone trained to notice patterns. Women who had failed to conceive for years suddenly bore children after brief absences of their husbands. Infants across different estates shared the same physical markers: eyes set the same way, hands shaped alike, a peculiar strength noted again and again in private letters. These observations were never written plainly. They were encoded. Robust. Uncommonly healthy. Vigorous beyond expectation. The enslaved community understood first. They always do. When you live without power, pattern recognition becomes survival. They watched the man move. They marked the births. They whispered dates. They understood that he was not being lent out for labor. He was being deployed. And yet, even among the enslaved, there was silence. Because speaking the truth did not liberate him. It endangered everyone. The man himself never spoke. Not once, in any surviving account, did he claim his children. Why would he? To do so would invite immediate execution. Or worse, sail south, where no record would follow him and no protection would remain. This is the psychological cage that held him. He was surrounded by his descendants, watching them grow up free, educated, inheriting land he could never touch. Sons who would one day own men like him. Daughters who would never know his name. Imagine the discipline required to endure that without breaking. And now understand the cruelty layered beneath it. The system did not merely exploit his body. It erased his legacy while multiplying it. 47 children by some later counts, all legally severed from him. His blood everywhere. His name nowhere. This is how power humiliates without appearing to. It allows you to contribute while denying you credit. It lets you build a world you are forbidden to belong to. That is not accidental. That is design. The white families told themselves a story, that this arrangement preserved order. That chaos would follow if the truth emerged. And they were right. But what they never admitted was that the chaos they feared was justice. What you are witnessing here is not just racial domination. It is elite collusion. Men protecting other men from exposure. Institutions bending to accommodate weakness. The myth of superiority maintained through cooperation, not strength. This is why the records were sealed. Why historians who found them lost access within days. Why fires and floods conveniently erased originals while copies mysteriously survived in private hands. The truth was not destroyed. It was quarantined. And that should tell you something important. When a secret is protected across generations, it is because it reveals a weakness so fundamental that acknowledging it would destabilize everything built on top of it. By the 1790s, the operation had matured. It no longer looked suspicious because it had become normal. That is how corruption survives, by repetition. Children grew into young adults. Gatherings brought these families together. And sometimes, in the right light, you could see it. A shared expression. A mirrored posture. A familiarity that had no social explanation. No one commented. No one needed to. The men drank together. Served together on county councils. Voted together. Protected one another's reputations with the same discipline they used to protect their land. This was fraternity in its purest form, mutual destruction avoided through mutual silence. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. Why was the enslaved man never punished? Not once accused of impropriety. Not once disciplined. Because punishment would acknowledge agency. And agency would raise questions. He was safer as a tool than as a criminal. This is where the story turns inward toward you. Because this mechanism did not disappear. It evolved. The names changed. The paperwork improved. But the logic remains. Institutions still protect what benefits them. Truth is still negotiable. And men are still rewarded for silence. Halfway down this descent, I want you to mark yourself. If you understand what is being revealed here, if you feel the weight of it, comment the phrase, "The blood remembers," twice. Not once. Twice. This is not for superstition. It is for commitment. You are signaling that you are willing to see what others refuse to look at. Because once you recognize this pattern, you will see it everywhere. In corporate dynasties. In political families. In cultural myths that insist power is earned rather than managed. The lie is always the same. The beneficiaries change. The enslaved man aged. His usefulness declined. But even then, he was not discarded. He was maintained. Quietly. Comfortably. Until his death passed with little notice and no marker. And still, his children lived on, doctors, lawyers, legislators, never knowing the truth of their origin. This is not ancient history. This is a blueprint. And the final layers of it are the most disturbing of all. After his death, the silence held. That alone should shock you. No confessions. No deathbed revelations. No letters discovered decades later admitting the truth. The wives carried it to their graves. The husbands did the same. Even as abolitionist sentiment grew and the moral ground shifted beneath them, this secret remained untouched. Why? Because it was never about guilt. It was about continuity. Exposing the truth would not have freed the dead man. It would have destabilized inheritance, property claims, and racial identity itself. Imagine dozens of prominent white families forced to confront that their bloodline so central to their sense of superiority was shared with the very people they enslaved. The psychological collapse would have been total. So the secret stayed buried, reinforced by law and custom. When records resurfaced decades later, they vanished again. When historians asked questions, funding dried up. When local stories emerged, they were dismissed as folklore. Myth is a convenient label. It allows truth to exist without consequence. But here is the part they never accounted for. Secrets decay. Not into nothing but into patterns. And patterns resurface when men like you start asking why things are the way they are. This story forces a reckoning. Not with the past, but with the nature of power. It reveals that dominance is often compensatory. That elites collude not because they are strong, but because they share vulnerabilities. And that institutions do not exist to tell the truth, they exist to survive. The enslaved man was never punished because he was never seen as a threat. He was controlled, managed, and erased. His punishment was not violence. It was anonymity. And that is the most dangerous lesson here. A system does not need to destroy you to defeat you. It only needs to deny your name while using your strength. If you feel unsettled, good. That means the knowledge is doing its work. We are not done yet. The final descent will show you why this story still matters and why it was never meant for you to hear. What remains after the bodies are gone is structure. And structure is where this story becomes truly dangerous. Because once you strip away the names and dates, what you are left with is a living model of how power preserves itself when reality becomes inconvenient. The Virginia arrangement did not rely on secrecy alone. It relied on distributed responsibility. No single man owned the crime. No single woman carried the blame. Everyone participated just enough to ensure no one could speak without destroying themselves. This is the quiet brilliance of institutional manipulation. Guilt is diluted until it disappears. Responsibility is fragmented. And the truth becomes so expensive that silence feels like virtue. The enslaved man was not protected out of compassion. He was protected because he functioned as a stabilizing mechanism. He absorbed the biological risk of elite failure while allowing the myth of superiority to remain intact. Look closely at what this means. White supremacy, in this instance, depended entirely on a black man's body. Not as an object of domination, but as a source of vitality. The very bloodline that justified enslavement was quietly replenished by the enslaved. That contradiction could not survive daylight. This is why the records were hunted. Why access was revoked. Why the story was allowed to exist only as rumor. Because it collapses the moral hierarchy. It reveals that the line between ruler and ruled was never as clean as advertised. It shows that power often feeds on what it publicly despises. And this is not unique to slavery. Every rigid hierarchy eventually faces a moment where its ideology collides with reality. When that happens, it can either adapt honestly or cheat quietly. History shows us which option is usually chosen. The men who orchestrated this were not monsters in the way you are taught to imagine monsters. They were administrators, husbands, churchgoers, civic leaders. That should concern you. Because it means the most destructive systems are often run by people who look respectable. This is why the enslaved man's silence mattered so much. He became the anchor that held the lie in place. And the system rewarded him just enough to keep him compliant. Better food. Better housing. Protection from random cruelty. Not freedom, never freedom, but survival. Understand the psychological precision here. When a system gives you just enough to lose, you will defend it without being asked. That is not weakness. That is conditioning. And if you think this ended in the 19th century, you have not been paying attention. The descendants grew up and moved on. Some west. Some into politics. Some into commerce. Their shared origin dissolved into the background noise of American expansion. New myths replaced old ones. Freedom. Merit. Destiny. But blood has a way of remembering, even when names are forgotten. What persisted was not the secret itself, but the method. Problems at the top were still solved quietly. Institutions still bent rules to protect legitimacy. Narratives were still curated. And men who benefited from the system still convinced themselves that exposure would do more harm than good. This is the deeper lesson meant to stay hidden. Not that powerful people commit moral transgressions that is obvious. But that systems are designed to make those transgressions invisible, acceptable, even necessary. The Virginia case shows you the raw mechanics. Once you understand them, you begin to see how often they are still in use. Ask yourself why certain family names endure despite repeated scandal. Why financial dynasties survive catastrophic failure. Why entire industries collapse without consequences for those at the top. The answer is not luck. It is insulation. The enslaved man's greatest threat was not rebellion. It was testimony. That is why he was kept isolated, comfortable, and silent. Today, the mechanisms are more refined. Non-disclosure agreements. Legal complexity. Reputation management. But the goal is identical: contain the truth until it loses its power. You are being trained, from birth, to mistake legitimacy for virtue. To assume that inheritance equals worth. This story is an antidote to that illusion. It shows you that much of what you are told to admire is built on concealed compromises. And here is the part that separates spectators from men of awareness. Once you see this, you cannot go back to sleep. You start asking who benefits. Who is protected? Who is erased? And why? The story was buried because it does not flatter the nation. It does not flatter masculinity. It does not flatter power. It reveals fragility at the core of dominance. And that is intolerable to any hierarchy that survives on myth. We are almost at the bottom now. And the final truth is the one most people cannot accept. The final truth is this: the enslaved man was not an anomaly. He was a prototype. A living solution to elite failure. And the reason this story was never meant to reach you is because it teaches a man how power actually works without costumes, without slogans, without moral theater. Power is not righteous. It is adaptive. When strength fails, it borrows. When ideology breaks, it improvises. And when exposure threatens, it erases. The Virginia mystery reveals that even the most rigid systems survive by violating their own rules in private while enforcing them in public. This is why the man was never punished. Punishment is for those who disrupt order. He maintained it. His existence stabilized families, estates, and reputations. To harm him would have been to harm the structure itself. So he was allowed to live, unnamed, unrecognized, and indispensable. And now, centuries later, you are hearing his story. Not to feel outrage. Not to feel pity. But to understand the nature of the game. Because once you understand that legitimacy is often manufactured, you stop seeking approval from systems designed to use you. This knowledge is dangerous because it removes illusion. It teaches you to look past narratives and into incentives. To recognize that silence is often bought, not earned. And that many of the truths shaping your world are not hidden because they are false but because they are effective. The descendants walk among you. The institutions still stand. The pattern persists. Only the names have changed. What you do with this awareness is up to you. Most men will dismiss it as history. Some will feel anger. A few will feel clarity. That clarity is the point. Because once a man understands how power survives, he can no longer be controlled by appearances alone. And that is why this story was sealed, burned, and buried. Not because it was unbelievable. But because it works.